Spain took 50 years to fall. The Soviet Union took 6. And the difference between those two timelines tells you exactly where America stands right now. Before we dive into the pattern, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me this. Which empire's collapse do you think most resembles where America is today? Spain, Britain, or the Soviet Union? I read every single comment, and your answers genuinely shape what I cover next. History records 7 stages through which every great empire passes. Not 4 stages, not 5, not 10. 7. And in 6 of the 8 empires that economists and historians have studied in depth, those 7 stages follow the same sequence, the same logic, the same financial signals. Cross-referenced against data from the Congressional Budget Office, the International Monetary Fund, and the academic work of historians, who have spent decades studying sovereign fiscal collapse. This is not speculation. This is a pattern you can measure, date, and verify. By the end of this video, you will understand what Stage 5 looks like from the inside, and why it is the most dangerous stage precisely because it does not feel dangerous. You will understand the specific financial signals that separate managed contraction from outright collapse. You will see why markets do not price in systemic sovereign risk until the moment that risk becomes impossible to ignore. And you will understand what one empire did differently that allowed it to navigate Stage 5 without disintegrating. There is exactly one empire in the modern historical record that managed this successfully. We are going to spend significant time on what they did right, because that is the only story in this video that actually matters for what comes next. Let me take you back 437 years. It is 1588. The Spanish Empire stretches from Peru to the Philippines, from Mexico to Milan. The Spanish crown commands the most powerful navy on earth. The silver of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, flows into Spanish coffers in quantities no empire in history has ever seen before. When Spanish diplomats enter a room, other nations move. When Spain declares a policy, Europe adjusts. To any observer standing in Madrid in 1588, the Spanish Empire looks invincible. This is the Stage 5 illusion. The empire looks strongest in the same decade that the fiscal collapse becomes mathematically irreversible. That is not a coincidence. That is the mechanics of Stage 5. In the summer of 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed to meet the English fleet in the waters of the English Channel. 130 ships, carrying approximately 19,000 soldiers, the greatest naval force ever assembled at that point in history. And it failed. Not in a single catastrophic battle, but in a series of skirmishes, bad weather, and logistical collapse. The Armada retreated. Storms destroyed it on the return voyage. Spain lost roughly 60 of its 130 ships. The cost of that fleet represented approximately 2 full years of total royal revenue. Here's what nobody's telling you about what happened next. Spain did not collapse, not immediately, not visibly. Philip II declared another bankruptcy in 1596, the 4th of his reign. But Spain remained the undisputed greatest military power in Europe for another generation. When Philip died in 1598, Spain still controlled more territory than any empire in history had ever governed simultaneously. The armies kept marching, the silver kept flowing, ambassadors kept bowing, but here is what was happening behind the visible strength. The debt service was consuming revenues that had not yet been collected. Bankers from Genoa and Germany were extending credit on the assumption that the next silver fleet from the Americas would cover what the current fleet could not. When Philip declared his 3rd bankruptcy in 1575, the outstanding debt represented approximately 1.9 times the crown's annual revenue. And that was not the last default. The system lurched forward on borrowed time and borrowed money simultaneously. By the 1620s, the silver shipments from the Americas were declining. By the 1640s, Spain was losing territory. By 1658, it had formally conceded military dominance to France at the Peace of the Pyrenees, acknowledging that a country which had built its power on silver imports and military spending could not sustain that power when the silver diminished and the spending could not. 50 years from Armada to effective collapse, the financial fracture happened in 1588. The visible collapse took 5 decades. Now you might be thinking, America has been declining for 50 years and it is still number 1. Every decade, someone predicts the fall and it never arrives. And that is exactly the point. Stage 5 is precisely why the decline is invisible from the inside. Spain's citizens in 1600 thought the same thing. Ambassadors still bowed, armies still marched, the currency still circulated across European trade routes. The fiscal rot had already passed the point of reversal. The timeline was already set. The citizens simply did not know it yet. And in Stage 5, they never do. Pattern honesty. Is Spain a perfect parallel for America today? No. Spain was a silver-dependent mono-economy with no diversified revenue base. America's economy is the most diversified in the history of civilization. The probability that America follows Spain's exact 50-year arc is low. But the mechanism, fiscal overextension, masking itself as strength, that mechanism is not uniquely Spanish. It is not uniquely European. It is the fiscal biology of every empire that has ever overextended its spending commitments beyond its sustainable revenue base. Bull case. America's diversification and institutional depth give it far more runway than Spain had. Bear case. America's military overextension across more than 700 overseas bases, combined with a debt service trajectory that is already consuming more revenue than defense spending, is tracking the Spanish fiscal data more closely than most people realize. Let me show you the second empire. 1956. The British Empire still governs over 700 million people across 6 continents. The pound sterling is the world's second reserve currency, held in the central bank vaults of dozens of nations. Britain invented the Industrial Revolution, built the modern rules of global finance, and spent the previous 3 centuries reshaping every major trade route on Earth. The Royal Navy, though smaller than its peak, still projected force across the globe. British advisors sat in the ministries of governments from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. The empire looked durable. In July of 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel responded with military force in October. What happened next was not a military defeat. Britain's soldiers performed exactly as expected. What happened was something more consequential than any military defeat could have been. Washington said, "Stop." The United States held approximately $3.75 billion in British debt, a legacy of the Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1945. Britain's total foreign currency reserves in October 1956 amounted to approximately $2.2 billion. Britain owed more than it held. And President Eisenhower, through the Treasury and through the International Monetary Fund, made clear that without American financial support, the pound sterling would face a speculative attack it could not withstand. Britain drew $561 million from the International Monetary Fund in December 1956. It was the equivalent of 100% of Britain's entire quota at the fund, 4 times larger than any previous drawing by any nation in the fund's history. And the condition imposed was simple: withdraw from Suez. Translation: Britain's military power was real. Britain's financial independence was not. Sound familiar? Because this is precisely what Stage 5 looks like from the inside. The military still functions. The currency still circulates globally. The ambassador still gets invited to every summit. But the moment you attempt to act independently on the global stage, you discover that the financial architecture, the system that actually determines whether your policy is executable, no longer belongs to you. Britain did not collapse after Suez. And here is the critical detail that this video is specifically built around. Britain managed a contraction. It transitioned slowly and painfully over approximately 2 decades, from empire to middle power. By 1976, Britain was forced to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund for the second time in 20 years. The pound had been devalued, manufacturing had declined substantially, but the institutions held, Parliament continued to function. The courts continued to administer justice. The Bank of England continued to manage monetary policy. Britain did not disintegrate. It contracted. That is a managed Stage 5 exit, and it is the rarest outcome in the historical record. If this is making sense, share this video right now. Most people have absolutely no idea this pattern exists, let alone that they are living inside it. Share it with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening. Then let us keep going, because the next empire is the one that went the other way. Pattern honesty. Is Britain a clean parallel for America? Not entirely. Britain's managed decline was enabled by its willingness to subordinate its foreign policy to American preferences in exchange for financial stability. America has no equivalent patron to defer to. That is both the strength and the vulnerability of the American position. The probability that America follows Britain's managed contraction path rather than a faster disintegration, medium to high, dependent almost entirely on the quality of institutional decision-making over the next decade. The institutions exist. The question is whether the political will to use them rationally under fiscal stress also exists. Let me show you what the fast version looks like. 1985. The Soviet Union is the largest country on Earth by land area, covering 1/6 of the planet's entire surface. It commands an arsenal of tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. Over 100,000 Soviet troops are deployed in Afghanistan. The Soviet economy, by Western estimates, represents approximately 60% of American gross domestic product. Soviet diplomats sit at every major negotiating table. The Warsaw Pact controls half of Europe. From Moscow, the empire looks enormous. From the outside, it still looks formidable. This is stage 5 from the Soviet side. Massive, credible, apparently stable. The fiscal signals told a different story entirely. Oil and natural gas had become the oxygen of the Soviet economy for 2 full decades. Exports of energy commodities constituted more than 50% of Soviet hard currency revenue by the 1980s. The entire architecture of Soviet global power, the subsidies to client states, the military wages, the food import financing, the technology acquisition, all of it flowed from oil. And in 1986, world oil prices collapsed. From approximately $35 per barrel in 1980 to below $10 per barrel in the months following September of 1985, when Saudi Arabia unilaterally flooded the market. The Soviet Union lost an estimated $20 billion per year in hard currency earnings in a matter of months. That was not a setback. That was an extinction-level fiscal event for an economy that had been using oil revenue to paper over the structural failures of central planning for a decade. When you cannot pay for grain imports, the store shelves go empty. When you cannot fund military wages, soldiers begin questioning loyalty to an empire that cannot pay them. When you cannot transfer subsidies to client states, those client states begin looking for other patrons. When hard currency reserves are exhausted and there is no oil revenue to replace them, the entire architecture of Soviet power, built on the assumption of perpetual energy income, loses its fiscal foundation simultaneously across every domain. By the autumn of 1991, the Soviet Union was effectively bankrupt, not officially, not in any public statement, but the hard currency reserves were, in the words of economists who studied the collapse in the years after, functionally near zero. At formal dissolution in December of 1991, the Soviet state left its successor, the Russian Federation, with $66 billion in external debt and only a few $billion in net gold and foreign exchange reserves against that obligation. 6 years, from visible stage 5 to complete stage 7, 1985 to 1991. Some of you are thinking this is just doomer content. You have been saying this for years, nothing changes. Look, this video is specifically about the one empire that survived stage 5 without collapsing. Britain. The entire rest of this video is about the path that is not collapse. But understanding the Soviet speed matters, because the variable between Britain and the Soviet Union was not the pattern. The pattern was identical. The variable was institutional quality at the moment of fiscal stress. The British institutions acknowledged the fiscal reality early enough to manage the transition. The Soviet institutions were structurally incapable of acknowledging failure until the failure was total. Pattern honesty. Is the Soviet Union a clean parallel for America? No. The Soviet Union had a command economy with no market correction mechanisms whatsoever. America has the most dynamic market economy in the historical record. The probability of a Soviet-style 6-year collapse for America, genuinely low. But the oil dependency parallel deserves more attention than it gets. The Soviet Union was fiscally dependent on one export for external stability. America is fiscally dependent on one asset, the dollar's reserve status, for the ability to issue debt at sustainable rates at the scale it currently operates. If that reserve status erodes meaningfully, the fiscal arithmetic changes in ways that no other single variable can compensate for. Sound familiar? Let me bring this to where we are right now. The United States national debt crossed $38 trillion in October of 2025. That number alone does not capture what stage 5 looks like from the inside. Here is what does. In fiscal year 2025, the United States paid approximately $970 billion in interest on its national debt. The Congressional Budget Office confirmed that interest payments on the public debt crossed $1 trillion for the first time in 2025, making interest the fastest growing category of federal spending. Net interest is already the third largest spending category in the federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare, and ahead of the entire national defense budget. The United States government now spends more on interest payments than on the military. That last sentence. Read it again. When Spain spent its silver on debt service that exceeded the revenues the crown had yet to collect, the pattern was set. When Britain discovered at Suez that its financial independence was illusory, the pattern was confirmed. When the Soviet Union lost its oil revenue and discovered it had no alternative fiscal foundation, the pattern ran its full course. The mechanism is identical each time. Spending commitments grow beyond the sustainable revenue base. The gap is covered with borrowing. And then some exogenous shock exposes the structural vulnerability that was always there beneath the surface of apparent strength. Now you might be asking, if the pattern is so clear, why are markets not pricing in collapse right now? Markets priced in British pound dominance until November of 1956. And then, in the space of 6 weeks, the pound nearly had to float free of its fixed rate. Markets priced in Soviet stability until 1989, and then, within 2 years, the Union itself ceased to exist. Markets do not price in systemic sovereign risk continuously over the years it is developing. They price it in at the moment the risk becomes operationally impossible to ignore. The repricing does not happen over decades. It happens in months, sometimes weeks. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from approximately 72% in 2001 to approximately 57% today, according to International Monetary Fund data from its currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves reporting. That is not collapse. That is exactly what the early phase of managed decline in a global reserve currency looks like. A slow, measurable erosion that few people notice precisely because it is gradual, right up until it is not. BRICS plus nations now control approximately 42% of global central bank foreign exchange reserves and are actively developing alternative transaction infrastructure, including Project M-Bridge, the cross-border digital currency platform designed specifically to allow trade settlement outside the dollar and the SWIFT system. The allies are not abandoning the dollar. They are hedging against it. That is the Suez signal, not the Soviet signal, not yet. But the direction is set, and the institutions that shape that direction are now too large to reverse without a level of geopolitical coordination that does not currently exist. If you are still with me at this point, smash the like button right now. The algorithm needs engagement to push this analysis to people who genuinely need to understand it. And leave a comment below. Which path do you think America is on? Britain's managed contraction or the Soviet fast collapse? I am reading every answer. Let me bring this down to where it actually touches your daily life. Stage 5 fiscal pressure is not abstract. Let me show you exactly what it means in your wallet right now. If you took out a $400,000 home loan at 3% interest, your monthly payment would be approximately $1,686. At 7% interest, that same loan costs approximately $2,661 per month. That is a difference of roughly $975 every single month. Over 30 years, that gap totals approximately $350,000 in additional interest. $350,000 on the same house, the same loan, the same street, simply because the fiscal conditions of the country in which you borrowed have changed. Think about what that means. Stage 5 is not a history problem. Stage 5 is a mortgage problem. Stage 5 is a business loan problem. Stage 5 is a retirement savings problem. It is the problem that sits quietly inside every financial decision you make under the assumption that fiscal conditions will remain stable. The dollar's global reserve share dropping 15 percentage points over 2 decades does not show up in your bank statement. It shows up in what that bank statement can actually buy, in imported electronics, in energy costs, in the price of everything manufactured using globally priced commodities. The mechanism is indirect, but the impact is real, and it compounds over time in ways that traditional financial planning often fails to account for. I am not a financial advisor, but here's what the data from these 3 historical cases consistently suggests. In the years before the Soviet fiscal collapse became visible, the institutions and individuals that had diversified their exposure out of Soviet-linked assets avoided the catastrophic losses that materialized in 1991. In the period following Suez, British investors who recognized that the pound's reserve status was no longer guaranteed, and who diversified into dollar-denominated assets and international equities in the 1960s, preserved significantly more real purchasing power through Britain's managed decline than those who held sterling exclusively. The consistent data pattern across all 3 of our case studies runs as follows. Sovereign fiscal overextension reduces the policy flexibility available to the currency issuing government. Reduced policy flexibility keeps interest rates higher for longer than markets initially expect, because the government cannot afford to let them fall without triggering further currency pressure. Higher interest rates for longer transfer wealth systematically from borrowers towards savers, but specifically towards savers holding assets that are insulated from currency depreciation or denominated in alternatives that benefit from the declining currency's erosion. During managed contractions, investors with diversified asset bases historically experience meaningfully smaller drawdowns than those concentrated in the declining currency's domestic assets. And crucially, the investors who recognized Britain's Stage 5 position in the 1960s had approximately 15 to 20 years of adjustment time. The investors who recognized the Soviet Stage 5 position in 1985 had 6 years. Nobody knows which clock America is currently on. The institutional quality, the democratic accountability structures, and the market dynamism all point toward the British path rather than the Soviet path. But the debt service trajectory, the speed at which interest payments are consuming discretionary fiscal space, is worth watching carefully and incorporating into your financial planning accordingly. Here is the final variable, the one that determined whether Spain collapsed, Britain contracted, or the Soviet Union disintegrated. Institutional quality at the moment of fiscal stress. Spain in the 1640s had lost the institutional coherence required to manage a controlled reduction in imperial ambition. The court of Philip IV could not align on whether to prioritize the Netherlands or France, the navy or the army. The institutions fractured under fiscal pressure because they had never been designed for strategic retreat. Retreat implied failure. Failure was politically intolerable, so the empire contracted involuntarily, through loss rather than through choice. Britain in the 1950s had parliamentary institutions stress-tested across 3 centuries of governance through war, industrial transformation, and democratic expansion. When Harold Macmillan became prime minister after Suez, he understood that the choice was between a managed contraction and an unmanaged one. He chose managed. The institutions supported that choice because they were designed to survive political humiliation without structural collapse. The Soviet Union in 1985 had institutions designed specifically to prevent public acknowledgement of institutional failure. Glasnost was not a strategic retreat. It was the first admission that what the fiscal data had been showing for a decade could no longer be suppressed. By the time the admission came, the adjustment time had already been consumed. American institutions, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the federal court system, the democratic electoral process, are architecturally far closer to the British model than to the Soviet model. That is the genuine bull case. The bear case is that those institutions are simultaneously under their most severe political stress since the 1930s, and institutional quality under stress is not a fixed quantity. It is a variable. The outcome depends on whether the institutions function as designed under the pressure of fiscal constraint and political polarization, or whether they fracture in the way Spain's institutions fractured in the 1640s, when the bills finally arrived faster than the revenues could cover them. The pattern is real. The outcome is not predetermined. The question is not whether the United States is in stage 5. The debt service data, the reserve currency erosion data, and the allied hedging behavior all suggest it is. The question is which path it follows from stage 5, the Spanish 50-year arc, the Soviet 6-year compression, or the British managed contraction that preserved democratic governance, financial system integrity, and basic living standards through 2 decades of deliberate strategic reduction. One empire did it. One survived stage 5. The variable was not resources, not geography, not military power. The variable was institutional quality and the willingness of those institutions to acknowledge fiscal reality before the fiscal reality became impossible to manage. That option is still open, but the window narrows with every year the debt service grows. Subscribe if you have not already. We are tracking this story as it develops in real time. Thanks for watching.